The studio lights at CNN blazed down on the sleek glass desk as Piers Morgan leaned forward, a smug grin spreading across his face. He had just unleashed what he believed was the perfect rhetorical blow, a sharp insult veiled as wit, aimed squarely at the man sitting across from him. Actor and spiritual voice Jonathan Roumie. Roumie didn't flinch. He didn't need to. His expression was still composed, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet certainty, the kind of certainty that doesn't need to shout. Piers didn't recognize that look, the look of a man who wasn't there to spar, but to reveal. Jonathan Roumie, Morgan had said with theatrical flourish, his words dripping with condescension, represents everything wrong with modern discourse. Actors pretending to be philosophers, feelings over facts, performance over policy. It was meant to be a mic drop moment, but what happened in the next 60 seconds would leave Piers Morgan staring down at the table, speechless, while Jonathan Roumie responded, not with fire, but with something far more disarming: truth, grace, and unshakable conviction. The tension in the studio was no longer entertainment, it was electric. And what Roumie would say and do next would leave even the producers in the control room frozen in awe. Before we dive into this extraordinary public moment, a moment that would soon ripple across social media and newsrooms worldwide, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss moments like this. Moments when pride gets humbled and truth takes the mic. Piers Morgan entered that CNN studio with the confidence of a man who had built an empire on being loud, sharp, and unfiltered. At 59, the British broadcaster had spent decades in media, from tabloid newspapers to primetime TV, branding himself as the one who says what everyone else is afraid to say. To his fans, he was a truth teller. To his critics, a bully. To himself, he was untouchable. He had debated politicians, celebrities, activists, and crushed many with a blend of sarcasm and volume. And tonight, he thought he was in for just another round of intellectual target practice. But across from him sat Jonathan Roumie. And Roumie was not what Morgan had expected. Not even close. Roumie wasn't a politician, nor a career pundit. He didn't posture or preach. But in recent years, he had become a quiet force, someone whose portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen had touched millions, and whose public appearances were marked by humility, moral clarity, and an almost unsettling serenity. What Roumie lacked in aggression, he made up for in presence, stillness, gravitas. And most dangerous of all to someone like Piers Morgan, he listened. While Morgan played to the cameras, Roumie prepared in silence. Tonight's panel had been advertised as a spirited discussion about our moral leadership in a divided age. CNN thought they were booking contrast, the brash traditionalist versus the spiritual actor. What they didn't realize was that they had unknowingly created a moral collision between ego and essence. Morgan assumed he would dismantle Roumie with ease, drown him in mockery, provoke a stumble, strip him of credibility by painting him as a man out of his depth. Roumie had a different plan: to hold up a mirror, not for himself, but for the man across the table. The segment began uneventfully. Anderson Cooper, always calm, asked both guests to reflect on the growing divide between public influence and moral accountability. Morgan launched into his typical monologue, blaming social media, blaming woke culture, mocking the softness of modern values. Then Roumie spoke, quietly, thoughtfully. He cited no political statistics, no party lines. Instead, he spoke about responsibility, the kind that starts at the level of the soul. He spoke of how fame can be used as a platform for service or as a spotlight for ego, of how leadership is not volume, but vision. That's when Piers Morgan made his first mistake. "Well, Anderson," he said with a smirk, "it's adorable hearing a man who plays Jesus talk about moral leadership. But let's be honest, acting isn't authority. Passion isn't wisdom. And quoting scripture doesn't make you a statesman." The studio fell silent. Cooper's eyes lifted slightly, a subtle sign he'd just witnessed a line being crossed. Roumie didn't blink, but for those who watched closely, there was a pause, not of hesitation, but of preparation. Something was coming, not an explosion. Something worse for Morgan, a revelation. Jonathan Roumie's voice was calm, but what resolute. The kind of tone that didn't need to be raised to carry weight. "I appreciate your concern about my understanding of how things work, Piers," Roumie said gently, his hands folded on the table. "But perhaps you could explain to the audience how your grasp of public discourse has led you to repeatedly dismiss solutions that would have brought tangible improvement to the mental health crisis you claim to care about so deeply. Piers Morgan's smile flickered, just slightly. He hadn't expected that kind of precision. He leaned back, straightening at his cuffs, recovering quickly. "Well, Jonathan," he said, the smirk creeping back in, "you've been in the spotlight for what, a few years? I've been in journalism and debate for over 3 decades. Sometimes experience teaches you that idealism makes for good theater, not policy." There it was, the condescension, so casual it could have been missed by anyone not paying close attention. But the studio crew noticed, Cooper noticed, and Roumie definitely noticed. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're absolutely right, Piers. Experience does matter. So let's talk about yours. In your 30 years on air, can you name 3 tangible initiatives you've led that made life measurably better for the people you claim to advocate for?" Morgan blinked. The question was asked with the softness of a breeze, but it landed like a hammer. He fumbled slightly. "I've been involved in many." "I didn't ask what you've been involved in," Roumie interrupted, still composed. "I asked what you've led, what you've authored. It's a simple question for someone who prides himself on experience." The silence in the room sharpened. Morgan's smile was gone now, replaced with something tighter, more defensive. Then he turned, not to Roumie, but to Anderson Cooper. "This is exactly the problem," he said, his voice louder, brittle. "These modern-day spiritual influencers think that throwing shade at real-world experience somehow qualifies as leadership. Jonathan here is what's wrong with this new wave. Soft voices, strong egos, and no grasp of how things actually work." He didn't even look at Roumie. The insult hovered in the air, not just patronizing, but diminishing. He had dismissed Jonathan not only as inexperienced, but fundamentally irrelevant. In the control room, a producer mouthed, "Clip that." Cooper didn't say a word. He leaned back and watched. Jonathan Roumie remained perfectly still, letting the words settle like dust before speaking. Then softly, so softly that everyone instinctively leaned in, he began. "Piers, just so I understand, you're saying I'm too new, too inexperienced, and too spiritually inclined to contribute to serious public discourse. Is that fair?" Morgan didn't back down. "I think people want leaders who understand complexity, not just rehearse comforting platitudes and quote scripture." Roumie nodded slowly, as if reflecting on something deeper. "And this wisdom of yours," he asked, "comes from what exactly? A career of provocation? Shouting louder than your guests? Or is it from the countless times you've used your platform to stir outrage without offering solutions?" There it was, the turn. Roumie reached beneath the table and pulled out a thin folder, just 1 page. The camera zoomed in instinctively. Everyone in live TV knew, when someone pulled out papers calmly, something was about to detonate. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a record of the past 10 debates you have hosted on mental health, education, and spiritual freedom. 3 topics you routinely mock or distort. And here is a list of the moments in which you interrupted, belittled, or redirected from those issues to talk about yourself, your ratings, or irrelevant controversies." Morgan stiffened. "I'm not here to embarrass you," Roumie continued, his tone never rising. "I'm here to ask why someone with your experience seems so afraid of sincere conversation, and why your instinct, when faced with humility, is to ridicule it." The studio fell completely silent. Cooper looked between them like he'd just witnessed something sacred or surgical. Then Jonathan set the paper down and folded his hands again. "You want to talk about experience? Before all this," he gestured vaguely at the cameras, the table, the lights, "I worked with recovering addicts. I spent years visiting prisons. I've sat beside grieving parents, abused teenagers, and people who'd lost all hope. I didn't host their pain. I carried it with them, quietly." Morgan tried to interject, but Roumie, without raising his voice, cut through him. "I'm not finished." The room froze. "I don't have 30 years of headlines, but in just a few I've helped raise millions for displaced families. I've supported suicide prevention campaigns. I've spoken to young people not to become famous, but to become whole." He turned slightly in his chair, his eyes settling directly on Morgan. "You mock people like me because we make you uncomfortable, because we don't fight like you, with volume or vanity. We fight with compassion, and whether you realize it or not, it terrifies you." The silence was thunderous. Piers Morgan was staring at the page on the table like it might burn him. And in that moment, millions of viewers across the world realized he hadn't just lost an argument. He'd been exposed by a man who didn't need to win, only to reveal. The authority in Jonathan Roumie's tone was unmistakable. It didn't shout, it didn't need to. This was the voice of someone who had learned to confront cruelty not with aggression, but with unwavering calm. Someone who knew how to silence a storm with a single truth. In the past 18 months, Roumie said, eyes still fixed on Piers Morgan, I've worked with 5 different humanitarian partners to pass real reform, not just talk. 5 major initiatives in 18 months. The camera cut to Morgan's face, the exact moment he realized he wasn't debating an actor. He was drowning in a conversation he thought he controlled. Roumie leaned in slightly, still gentle, still grounded, but now undeniably focused. You mentioned complexity, he said. Let's explore that. He lifted the page once more, the one that made the studio lights feel suddenly 10 degrees hotter. In 21, you mocked mental health advocates in 2 separate broadcasts, episodes that went viral for the wrong reasons. You called them soft, overly emotional, dramatic. Morgan's mouth opened slightly, but no words followed. Roumie didn't stop. In 2022, when child poverty programs were expanded through bipartisan effort, you called them handouts. Not once, but in 3 interviews. Roumie's voice never changed, calm, almost kind. But with every sentence, Morgan seemed to shrink an inch in his chair. And just last year, when UK veterans called for stronger post-trauma care, Roumie continued, you said they needed to toughen up, while tweeting about your own stress from media backlash. Piers Morgan looked stunned, like he'd just realized he'd brought sarcasm to a soul-level confrontation. Finally, he managed something. Those moments were taken out of context. Context? Roumie raised an eyebrow. You speak often of fiscal responsibility, of strength. But how does that reconcile with defending billionaires while dismissing the broken? How does a platform as large as yours consistently punch down and call it journalism? There were murmurs in the crew now. Even Cooper looked like he was watching history. This isn't just a disagreement anymore, Roumie said quietly. This is a masterclass in how noise masquerades as depth and how ego mislabels itself as leadership. Then came the shift. Roumie's voice softened, not out of fatigue, but out of precision. You called me an actor pretending to be a moral voice, a symbol of what's wrong with modern conversation. He paused, just long enough for the moment to breathe. So let me ask you something, Piers. His voice dipped into something sharper, more personal. When you look at me, what is it you really see that makes you think I don't belong at this table? The question hit like a thunderclap. Everyone in the room knew what was really being asked. Morgan shifted in his seat. His media instincts screamed retreat, but his pride whispered deflect. I see someone who hasn't lived in this world long enough to... No, Roumie cut him off, his voice like a bell ringing in the dark. That's what you think you see. He leaned back in his chair, not defensive, but ascendant. What you actually see is a man of faith, someone who speaks softly because he's not afraid to listen, someone who walked into your world, not to win, but to remind you what you forgot, that truth doesn't tremble just because someone's louder. The studio was dead silent. Even Cooper looked stunned. Roumie continued, his voice now fully grounded, as if he were speaking not to Morgan, but to the audience and to history. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, and he said, I see a man who's built a kingdom on mockery, who's mistaken cynicism for clarity, who's spent so long being the one asking questions, you forgot how to answer them. Morgan's face had gone from smug to pale, from pale to red. You want to talk about experience? Roumie said, folding his hands again. I've spent my life walking into rooms where I was underestimated because of my faith, my background, or because I wasn't angry enough to be taken seriously. He reached into the folder once more and held up another sheet. This time, no numbers, just a single sentence highlighted in yellow. This is from your campaign to raise funds for media freedom. 78% of your donors were foreign nationals. And during that same year, you repeatedly argued against media regulation that would have protected whistleblowers. Morgan's face dropped. Oh yeah, and this, Roumie added, gently setting down the second page, is your attendance record at charity panels addressing religious discrimination. You missed every single one. Then he looked up, not at Morgan, but straight into the camera. Piers said I represent everything wrong with the new generation of voices. Let me tell you what I actually represent. The studio air went still. The lights suddenly seemed warmer. He was no longer responding, He was testifying. I represent what happens when you mistake humility for weakness. When you assume that someone quiet has nothing to say. I represent preparation over performance, presence over provocation. And I'm not intimidated by your resume or your tone. The camera closed in on Morgan's eyes lowered to the desk, on Roumie's steady, luminous expression. I represent a new way forward, Roumie said. One that listens, one that builds, one that calls out injustice, not with rage, but with light. He turned directly to the audience and to every young person watching who's been told they're too soft, too inexperienced, or not cynical enough to be taken seriously. This is what conviction looks like. This is what happens when you walk into the fire with peace in your hands. No one spoke, because nothing more needed to be said. The studio was dead silent, except for the soft, mechanical hum of the cameras. Piers Morgan sat motionless, his gaze locked on the table in front of him, his hands still, his posture deflated, like a man who had just witnessed the slow collapse of his own carefully curated authority. Anderson Cooper, a veteran of thousands of interviews, took a moment to breathe, to process what he had just witnessed. Then, finally, he turned back to the camera. "We're going to take a quick break," he said slowly, a trace of awe in his voice. "When we come back, well, I'm not sure what we'll talk about, because I think Jonathan Roumie just said everything that needed to be said." Before CNN even returned from commercial, social media erupted like a digital wildfire. The clip of Roumie's quiet dismantling of Piers Morgan, deliberate, unshaken, and deeply human, spread across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram with viral speed. Within 30 minutes, hashtag Roumie humbles Piers was trending #1 worldwide, and the phrase "staring at the table" became an instant meme, the new symbol for someone who'd just been undressed with facts, composure, and moral clarity. A viral post by a Public Theology read, "Jonathan Roumie just gave a masterclass in how to respond to arrogance, not with ego, but with eternal truth." That wasn't debate, that was restoration. Another from @NextGenVoices said, "Piers came looking for a brawl. Jonathan brought the Beatitudes, but the most shared message came from that veteran Faith who wrote, Piers mocked our pain for years. Roumie didn't yell, he didn't insult, he just revealed. We've been waiting a long time for someone like this." Across the internet, memes exploded. Split-screen images of Piers' smug opening smile next to his stunned, defeated stare, captioned, "How it started versus how it ended." Fan-made posters of Roumie, sitting calmly in the studio, were stylized like a film cover. He brought the gospel to a gunfight. Another read, "Preparation is silent until it speaks." One particularly viral meme showed Roumie holding his folder mid-debate with the text, "When they call you soft, but you've read everything they've ever said." Political figures joined the chorus. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what happens when you underestimate a quiet man with a deeper voice than your volume can ever reach." Senator Elizabeth Warren added, "My fine, preparation meets grace." And Jonathan Roumie just taught every young leader watching that humility is not weakness, it's strength held steady. Even some conservatives couldn't help but acknowledge the moment. Former GOP strategist Rick Wilson posted, "I disagree with Roumie on theology, but that was a surgical takedown. Piers walked into a baptism and got drowned." Meanwhile, right-wing media tried to control the narrative and failed. The RNC's official post read, "Piers Morgan stands for truth in media." The replies were merciless. "Truth? He got rebuked with scripture and receipts. Did you even watch the clip?" Roumie didn't speak over him. He spoke through him. Tucker Carlson attempted a counterattack on his evening show, framing the exchange as another attack on strong men by the woke left. But even Carlson's audience didn't buy it. One viewer wrote under the YouTube clip, "I'm conservative," but Roumie didn't attack. He taught, he exposed, and he did it without raising his voice. Within hours, major news outlets published fact checks of Roumie's claims, and every single one stood up. The Washington Post ran a headline, "Roumie versus Morgan, a fact check of grace and accuracy," and confirmed that every document Roumie cited, every statistic, every absence he mentioned was correct. CNN's Daniel Dale released his breakdown. "We found no factual errors in Jonathan Roumie's statements. All references to Morgan's past broadcast and donation records are accurate and publicly verifiable." But the clip's impact didn't end with fact-checking. Within days, professors at Yale, Oxford, and Georgetown had assigned the exchange in courses on communication, ethics, and leadership. Professor Sarah Chen at Georgetown wrote, "This wasn't just a media moment, it was a generational shift, proof that in a culture obsessed with clout, depth still wins." Young professionals and theology students began circulating the clip as required viewing, a new kind of training video not in political debate, but in spiritual resistance through composure. Testimonies poured in on social media. "As a seminary student, I've never seen anything more empowering. I'm a young Catholic. Watching Roumie stand his ground gave me hope I didn't know I needed. I studied law. That was more impactful than half our moot court competitions." As for Piers Morgan, his team issued a carefully worded statement the next morning. Mr. Morgan stands by his views and remains committed to fostering challenging conversations. But when reporters pressed for a rebuttal to Roumie's facts, the answer was always the same. That segment was edited unfairly. It's just performance. Let's not get caught up in sound bites. But the internet wasn't listening. The truth had already spoken, and it had gone viral. Piers Morgan himself remained publicly silent for nearly 48 hours, an eternity in modern media time. When he finally resurfaced on a friendly UK radio show, his voice was subdued. His explanation? Vague. "Sometimes," he said, "in the heat of discussion, things can be taken out of context." But the host surprisingly pushed back. "Were Jonathan Roumie's claims inaccurate?" the host asked directly. Morgan hesitated. "Well, media history can be complicated." "That's not an answer, Piers," the host replied bluntly. Even on his own turf, Morgan couldn't escape the quiet precision of Roumie's words, still echoing in the minds of millions. Within a week, the numbers told the story. Jonathan Roumie's favorability across faith-based and independent voters rose by 27%. His social media following more than tripled, with videos of the encounter translated into over a dozen languages. Piers Morgan's ratings dipped, especially in markets with younger viewers and international audiences. His reputation as an unshakable host began to crack, not through scandal, but through exposure. But beyond numbers, something deeper had shifted. Newsrooms, inspired by the viral weight of the moment, began placing renewed emphasis on real-time fact-checking during interviews. The term the Roumie standard emerged, shorthand for a new kind of media integrity, calm, precise, and fully documented. Meanwhile, seminaries, leadership academies, and journalism schools began teaching the moment, not as political drama, but as a study in moral composure. It was preparation meeting provocation, said Professor Dana Whitfield at Oxford School of Public Leadership, and the preparation didn't flinch. Comedy shows couldn't resist. Stephen Colbert dedicated a full segment titled "How to Get Roumied," dramatizing Morgan trying to change the subject, while Roumie calmly pulled out another document. SNL aired a skit where every debate ended with someone quietly saying, "Actually, I brought your record." And perhaps most telling, the phrase "pulling a Roumie" entered the pop political lexicon, meaning to calmly destroy someone's argument with truth, faith, and receipts. But behind the memes and commentary, the moment revealed something weightier. It exposed the illusion of authority based on volume and tenure, and elevated a new standard based on substance, restraint, and spiritual clarity. Roumie didn't just win a debate, he offered a blueprint. That preparation matters more than posturing. That humility can be a form of power. That truth, when spoken without fear, doesn't need to shout. 6 months later, Jonathan Roumie's name was being whispered in places far beyond Hollywood or church pews. Universities invited him to speak not just on faith, but on civic courage. Public schools requested his videos for leadership curriculum. Humanitarian organizations partnered with him on global campaigns for mental health, justice reform, and youth education. He had become something more than an actor or advocate. He had become a symbol of what could happen when conviction meets composure in the public square. And Piers? His show continued, but with less edge, fewer confrontations. He avoided faith-based guests. And behind the scenes, producers began warning, "Don't underestimate the quiet one. We're not going viral again." The Roumie-Morgan encounter became required viewing in communications courses, religious studies, and even business leadership training. It illustrated 5 core lessons. 1. Preparation beats reputation when reputation lacks results. 2. Facts delivered with gentleness are more powerful than insults shouted in anger. 3. Knowing your opponent is vital, but knowing yourself is non-negotiable. 4. Stillness disarms. Calmness cuts deeper than noise. 5. Documentation turns faith into proof. But perhaps the most ironic truth of the entire encounter? Piers Morgan's dismissive tones, the very tool he had used to dominate so many, was exactly the thing Jonathan Roumie had faced his entire career. As an actor of faith, as a man who wore humility openly, as someone uninterested in ego-driven conflict, Roumie had been talked over, underestimated, and laughed at. Until now. Piers thought he was dealing with an idealist. Instead, he met a craftsman of truth, and he brought bravado to a conversation meant for stillness. The moment served as a quiet but permanent warning to everyone in public life. In the age of viral videos and instant receipts, you don't just need a message, you need to mean it. Because somewhere out there, someone half your volume may have already done their homework. If this moment moved you, don't let it end here. Jonathan Roumie showed the world that humility, preparation, and truth still have power, even in the loudest rooms. If you believe in voices that challenge arrogance without raising their own, if you want more stories where facts silence ego and light overcomes noise, subscribe to the channel. We bring you the most powerful public moments, the ones people don't forget. Hit the bell so you never miss the next time truth goes viral, and let us know in the comments, what did you think of Jonathan Roumie's calm takedown? We read every word, we listened, just like he did.